The first punch never landed. It stopped less than an inch from my face. For 3 seconds, the entire neighborhood went silent as a 24-year-old black belt stood in my driveway, breathing heavily, waiting for me to react. Behind him stood his wealthy father, a man who had spent years believing money could make every problem disappear. They expected the quiet neighbor who spent his mornings fixing an old pickup truck to become frightened. They didn't know that 30 years earlier, I had stood in places where fear could get people killed. They didn't know I had once led a Navy SEAL team through situations where every decision had consequences. And most importantly, they didn't know why I had promised myself that I would never fight again unless someone I loved was in danger. If you believe in kindness, second chances, and the idea that true strength doesn't have to be loud, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear this message, and subscribe to Dad's Soul Diaries. Your support helps us continue telling stories where humility, courage, and compassion matter more than pride. My name is Graham Mercer, and at 62 years old, I had become the kind of man people rarely noticed. I lived in a small blue house at the end of a quiet suburban street where children rode bicycles after school and neighbors waved from their front porches. My yard wasn't perfect. The paint on my fence was beginning to peel, and my garage door made a terrible grinding noise every time I opened it. But I liked it that way. There was comfort in ordinary problems. A broken lawn mower could be fixed. A leaking faucet could be repaired. A stubborn engine could be understood if you were patient enough. Human beings were more complicated. I had moved into the neighborhood 8 months earlier after spending years traveling from one place to another. My wife, Rosalind, had passed away after a long illness, and after she was gone, the house we had shared became unbearably quiet. So I sold it, packed what I needed, and moved somewhere nobody knew my history. I didn't want recognition. I didn't want people asking questions about my past. I wanted mornings with coffee, afternoons in my garage, and evenings watching the sun disappear behind the trees. My closest neighbor was Victor Halstead, a wealthy businessman who owned several construction companies. His house looked less like a home and more like a private resort. Tall stone walls surrounded the property, expensive vehicles sat beneath a covered entrance, and landscapers arrived every Tuesday to keep the grass looking perfect. Victor was not necessarily cruel, but he had developed the habit of measuring people by what they owned. His son, Blaine Halstead, had inherited that habit without inheriting his father's patience. Blaine was a black belt and competed in regional martial arts tournaments. He trained almost every morning in a private studio attached to his father's house. I occasionally saw him practicing through the open garage doors. He was talented. I could tell that immediately. His movements were fast, disciplined, and technically impressive. But there was something missing. Humility. The first time Blaine spoke to me, he had been standing beside his expensive sports car while I was changing the oil in my old pickup. He looked at the truck, then at me, and asked why I continued driving something that looked like it belonged in a junkyard. I laughed and told him the truck had never complained about being old. He didn't understand the joke. After that, he mostly ignored me. Until the afternoon his father held a large neighborhood gathering. It was a bright Saturday afternoon, the kind where the sky seemed impossibly blue. Victor had invited dozens of people to his backyard. There were tables filled with food, music playing softly, and children running between the patio and the lawn. I wasn't planning to attend, but Victor personally invited me while I was collecting my mail. I almost refused. Then I remembered Rosalind always telling me that isolation wasn't the same thing as peace. So I went. For the first hour, everything was pleasant. I spoke with a few neighbors, drank lemonade, and stayed mostly near the edge of the yard. Blaine was there too, wearing a black training shirt and surrounded by several friends who clearly admired him. Eventually someone asked him to demonstrate a few martial arts techniques. He agreed. The crowd gathered around him. Blaine moved through a series of impressive forms, striking pads held by one of his friends. Everyone applauded. Victor looked especially proud. Then Blaine noticed me. He stared for several seconds before walking toward me. He asked whether I had ever trained. I told him a long time ago. He smiled and asked what kind. I said I had learned enough to understand when a fight wasn't necessary. His friends laughed. Blaine didn't. He asked whether I was afraid to demonstrate. I told him I wasn't interested. He insisted. I refused again. Something changed in his face. He had been enjoying the attention, and my refusal somehow made him feel embarrassed. He stepped closer. He said I was acting tough because I knew he wouldn't hurt an older man. I told him that was exactly why I wasn't going to fight him. Victor walked over and tried to calm the situation, but Blaine was already determined to prove something. He said he wanted one controlled sparring match. I said no. He asked why. I looked at him and told him that there was nothing to prove. That sentence seemed to anger him more than anything else. He stepped into my driveway later that afternoon. I had gone home early. I was kneeling beside my pickup when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned. Blaine was standing there. He told me he wanted his fight. I told him to go home. He raised his hands. He said he wasn't leaving until I gave him what he wanted. I stood slowly. My knees weren't what they used to be. My shoulders ached in the mornings. I looked like an ordinary 62-year-old man because I was one. But Blaine didn't know that once, many years earlier, those same hands had held the lives of other men in them. He stepped forward. I told him one last time not to do this. He smiled. Then he threw the punch. My body reacted before my mind finished processing the movement. I shifted my weight. His fist passed beside my cheek. I caught his wrist and redirected his momentum. He stumbled forward. I released him immediately. No strike. No retaliation. Just control. Blaine turned around, shocked. For the first time, I saw uncertainty in his eyes. He tried again. This time he moved faster. I stepped aside. He lost his balance. I placed one hand against his shoulder and stopped him before he fell. He stared at me. I told him that he had good training. But he was using it for the wrong reason. He attacked again. I didn't hurt him. I simply kept moving. Every time he attempted to corner me, I moved away. Every time he tried to grab me, I redirected him. Within less than a minute, he was breathing hard while I was standing almost exactly where I had started. Then Victor arrived. He had followed his son outside. He looked at me differently. He asked how I had learned to move like that. I didn't answer. Blaine demanded to know why I wasn't fighting him seriously. I looked at him and said something I had learned many years ago. A good fighter doesn't measure victory by how badly he can hurt someone. A good leader measures victory by how many people come home. Blaine went completely still. Victor asked what I meant. I looked toward the street. For years I had avoided saying the words. But that afternoon, there was no reason to hide anymore. I told them I had once served in the United States Navy. Blaine laughed nervously and said that didn't explain anything. I told him I had served as a Navy SEAL. His expression changed. Then I told him that for several years, I had led a small SEAL team during overseas operations. Nobody spoke. The wealthy businessman who had spent years surrounded by powerful people suddenly looked at me as though he were seeing a completely different man. But I wasn't proud of the fear on their faces. I told Blaine that my past wasn't a trophy. It wasn't something I carried around to intimidate people. I had buried friends. I had watched young men walk into dangerous places knowing they might not return. I had learned that courage wasn't about being fearless. It was about controlling yourself when fear was screaming inside you. Blaine lowered his hands. He asked why I had never told anyone. I said because I wasn't interested in being introduced as a former SEAL. I wanted to be introduced as Graham. A neighbor. A man who fixed old trucks. A widower who was trying to learn how to live alone. Victor looked embarrassed. He admitted that he had judged me because of my house, my truck, and my clothes. I told him that most people do. Then something unexpected happened. Blaine stepped forward. His eyes were no longer arrogant. He apologized. Not just for challenging me, but for the way he had treated me from the beginning. I accepted. But I told him an apology meant nothing unless something changed afterward. The following week, Blaine came to my garage. He didn't bring his friends. He didn't wear his black belt. He simply stood there holding a small box of pastries his mother had sent over. He asked whether I would teach him something. I asked what. He said he wanted to learn how to control his ego. I laughed for the first time in weeks. Then I invited him inside. Over the next few months, we trained together. Not every day. Sometimes we didn't train at all. Sometimes we worked on my truck. Sometimes Blaine helped me repair the fence. Sometimes we sat outside and talked. He began understanding that martial arts weren't really about fighting. They were about discipline. Patience. Respect. Responsibility. And knowing when to walk away. One afternoon, Blaine told me he had entered another tournament. I asked whether he wanted to win. He said yes. Then he smiled and said he wanted to win without becoming the person he used to be. That answer meant more to me than any medal ever could. Months later, Blaine won his match. But when the crowd applauded, he didn't raise his arms immediately. He looked toward the edge of the room. I was standing there. He nodded. I nodded back. Afterward, he gave the medal to his father. Victor became a different man too. He started greeting neighbors without asking what they did for a living. He began volunteering at a local youth center. And every Sunday morning, he brought breakfast to my house. Sometimes the richest lesson isn't about money. Sometimes it is about discovering that the person you thought was insignificant has survived things you could never imagine. And sometimes the strongest person in the room is the one who doesn't need anyone to know how strong he really is. Years ago, I had led men through dangerous places. But standing in my quiet garage with Blaine beside me, I realized something Rosalind had understood long before I did. Coming home wasn't about finding a peaceful place. It was about becoming peaceful yourself.